Our school went into lockdown in 6th grade and nothing about it makes any sense. This story is old, almost 15 years old at this point. To this day, it remains probably the single most unexplained event in my entire life. Those who witnessed it seldom, if ever, speak about it. All these years later, and I'm still not sure what to make of it, so I figured posting it here may lead to some answers. I was in 6th grade at the time, but my memory of the day is as vivid now as it was then, much to my dismay. I've suffered from nightmares on and off ever since, and the true extent of my mental well-being may never be truly known. It started like any other day, with me grumpily walking to catch the school bus and nearly missing it as per the norm. It was mid-September at the time, with temperate winds and comforting warmth renowned of early autumn. The place I grew up in was a small Midwestern town in the central United States. The whole school had only maybe 200 kids in it in grades 1 through 8, and my bus only brought around 20 to 30 of us. My friends Scotty and Lamar hopped on at the second stop, and the three of us discussed Yu-Gi-Oh cards most of the way to school. Maybe most of this is irrelevant, but I think it's important to emphasize how boring and routine this whole day began. It made what happened later that much stranger. It wasn't until lunch that something finally happened. I'd met up with Scotty, Lamar, and a few of our other friends. After eating, we formed a group and went out onto the grass field to play our variation of football. The style we played was known as smear the deer, with deer being a different, rhyming word that may get me canceled for saying nowadays. For those that don't know, it was American football, but with more youthful angst. Somebody would just punt the ball, and whoever got it would run aimlessly while praying to the good Lord above as everyone else tried to obliterate them. As you can imagine, it spawned a lot of fights and got many of us suspended over the years, and yet we kept playing because we were dumb school children. So one of the kids punts it, and this kid named Robert catches it. He made it like 3 steps before getting clobbered by like 5 kids, to the laughter and winces of everyone else. Things went on that way for a bit, and at some point, Kyle got the ball. Kyle was the best punter in terms of distance, but knowing which direction it would go was anyone's guess. So Kyle boots it, and we watch as it soars far to the left and off into the woods. Our school was in the middle of this big field, and the improvised football field was right next to the woods that surrounded it, all about 200 yards out. "Good job, Kyle, you dumbass." Another kid, Preston, jeered. Kyle just laughed and flipped him off as he jogged towards the tree line to retrieve it. He reached it a moment later and slowly began searching the woods while the rest of us waited. I watched as he looked around in there, and suddenly he just froze up. His whole body just went stiff as a board, and he just stood there staring for like 10 seconds before someone finally yelled at him to hurry up. Kyle didn't budge, nor react to the insult in any way. Another few seconds passed before he slowly turned back to face us. That's when I noticed the slack-mouthed, wide-eyed expression on his face. "Damn, Kyle, you shit your pants or something?" Another kid, Carlos, said with a laugh, but Kyle's expression didn't falter. He then quickly glanced back at the woods. A split second later, he fell onto his back, scrambling backward and muttering frantically, "Now fuck that, man, fuck that." He was met with a chorus of laughter from the others. Without pausing at all, Kyle just walked quickly back towards the school without another word. The others made jokes and laughed, but his reaction unsettled me. The horror on his face appeared genuine, and I'd never seen him look like that. Kyle was the type to never seem afraid of anything, and seeing him react like he did was downright worrying. Scotty and I then silently approached the spot that Kyle had gone to, both of us now a bit hesitant. The rest of the group had now gone mostly silent, with only muttered conversation in hushed tones behind us. Once we reached the grove, we slowly peered within. I spotted the football almost right away, only about 30 feet within, but no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I'd been in that patch of woods 100 times before, and nothing looked any different. Nothing obvious that would have spooked Kyle like that, but still I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. It was an odd feeling, but I just shrugged it off. Ignoring them, I sauntered inside to grab the ball. As soon as my hand touched it, something changed. I've still not found the best way to describe this, but the closest thing is like when a plane depressurizes. My ears popped, and my equilibrium seemed knocked off kilter for a split second. It was the weirdest feeling, and it struck me completely out of nowhere. After pausing for a moment to confirm I wasn't about to pass out or something, I grabbed the ball and stood back up. As soon as I did, I felt something on the back of my neck. Hot air came in rhythmic and rancid waves, like someone was breathing down my neck. I spun back around, my heart suddenly racing in my chest. There was nothing behind me aside from Scotty standing and staring unsettled back at me. "You good, dude?" he asked. Truth be told, I didn't know whether I was or not, or how to account for what had just happened, but I nodded back anyway. Part of me wondered whether it was just anxiety or something, but I didn't know what to think. As a young boy in middle school, though, admitting to fear was social suicide and not something I was about to do. "You didn't see anything behind me? Did you?" Scotty gave me a curious glance. "No, why?" It was clear to me he wasn't lying, and he was standing much too far away for it to have been him messing with me somehow. Furthermore, I heard no footsteps behind me, and if it had been him, then the piles of leaves on the ground would have been a dead giveaway. With an uncertain shiver, I shrugged it off as best I could, and the two of us returned to the others with the ball. I didn't play much after that, as my mind was suddenly convinced that something was very wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint it. It felt like someone was watching us, hidden well within the trees. Eventually, I decided to go try and find Kyle, but the bell rang before I could. Math was my next class, and I spent most of it trying to forget that unnerved feeling and calm myself down. Things went as normal, but after about 20 minutes, I felt myself needing to pee. The teacher excused me to go to the restroom, and I grabbed the hall pass from her desk as I exited the classroom. As I made my way down the hall, I noticed that outside had gotten suddenly dark. Not dark enough for night, but dark like a thick overcast of clouds. Since the sun had been shining brightly during lunch, I found that kind of odd too, but didn't think much more of it. As mentioned earlier, our school was small in terms of students and faculty, so of course the building itself was no exception. It was only about 75,000 square feet, or about 20,000 smaller than the average Walmart. It was just outside our hometown, and about half a mile away from the local police station. The lights flickered when I was in the bathroom washing my hands. Again, not something super unusual, as the school was old and prone to the occasional electrical mishap. They stabilized a moment later, and I made my way out back into the hallway. As soon as I exited the bathroom, I froze. The outside window had gotten much darker than before, like it was suddenly the middle of the night. My initial thought was cool, a solar eclipse, but as someone emerged from the office, that thought evaporated. A familiar middle-aged man hustled into the hallway, scrambling to the front doors and quickly locking them. It was our school principal, and as he turned to face me standing in the hall behind him, I saw an unrivaled terror etched upon his face. "Get back to your class now. Tell your teacher, Code Silver." My heart sank as I heard the words, and I realized the deadly seriousness in his voice. Without a word, I sprinted back to the classroom, flinging the door open and scrambling inside as I got one last look behind me. The entire environment seemed to have flipped in an instant, and something was very wrong. My teacher, Mrs. Smith, scolded me in an annoyed tone as I re-entered. I turned back from the door and stared at her. Her expression seemed to slowly turn from cross to visibly concerned. "Code Silver," I muttered. Mrs. Smith's eyes went wide. "Lock the door. Everyone into the corner, now," she commanded. The students did as requested, quickly filing into the corner and out of sight from the door. I locked the door and Mrs. Smith rushed towards me to ensure it was secure. After which she rushed back to her desk, dialed a few numbers in her desk phone, and spoke. Her voice blared over the intercom, reiterating the lockdown order for all others in the school. Everyone packed together tightly into the corners, out of sight of the door. The entire class then hunkered down as we had practiced many times before. Once there, Mrs. Smith doused the lights, and everything fell eerily silent. The next few moments we heard the faint sounds of the next door classrooms, likely doing the same as all of us held our breath. Most American kids probably know that Code Silver is the national alert given for an active shooter. Anyone who attended a school in the States probably remembers practicing the lockdown drills at one point or another. The whole class just locks the doors and hides together in the corner. The only defense is the locked door and hope that whatever danger is outside will not be able to get in. "What did you see out there, Eric?" one of the girls in the class whispered to me. Mrs. Smith shushed the both of us before I could reply. I pondered the same question in silence as we all waited. The sounds of the other classrooms soon hushed as well. The entire vicinity felt eerily quiet as all of us waited like fish trapped in a barrel. The more I thought about the way the principal reacted, the less sense it made. I hadn't seen anything to indicate an active shooter and just assumed that he had. And yet still, I had no explanation for how things had suddenly gone so dark. It wasn't like a school shooter could affect the weather, and the windows were far too large for someone to have covered them so quickly. Something very different was happening. The hallway lights extinguished a few minutes later, leaving us alone in silence and sudden complete darkness. Even the windows in the classroom didn't show any light from beyond, and the darkness became so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. We stayed like that for several minutes before a sudden calamity struck. It sounded like the shattering of glass and creaking of metal. My heart was throbbing in my chest then, and the muffled sounds of crying and whimpering from the other students surrounded me. Mrs. Smith shushed us all, trying her best to maintain order. By that point, my eyes had adjusted a bit to the darkness, and I could see Mrs. Smith looking through the door's side windows. Silence befell once more, a lingering malaise that lasted several minutes. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith audibly gasped and backed away from the window. I saw her hold her index up to her lips and could see tears sparkle in her eyes. Suddenly, the room began to grow brighter. I thought the power was coming back on when I realized the light was coming from something out in the hallway. It was a bright effervescence with a very slight reddish tint that softly shimmered. The light seemed to flicker ever so slightly, like that of a flashlight losing power, but different somehow. In the years since I've tried to replicate that light using various other light sources, but I've never quite gotten it right. It wasn't a flashlight or open flame producing the light, that much I'm certain of, and I can't say for certain what it was. A sound emerged along with it, sounding like wet, squishy footsteps as though someone were trudging through a swamp. They came closer, and the light grew brighter. In a few seconds, it seemed to be directly outside the classroom door, and I could feel the other students holding their breaths. A slight thud hit the door, and none of us dared make a sound. The door handle jiggled slightly, but from our vantage point, none of us could see who or what was on the other side. The light seemed to flicker and change intensity outside, beaming through the windows in altered variations. We were hunkered down perpendicular to the door, meaning the light couldn't reach us so long as it stayed outside. We could only hide there and offer silent prayers that whatever was making the light wouldn't get in. By some miracle, it didn't, and several seconds later the jiggling handle stopped. The footsteps then grew distant and the light faded. The relief was palpable, but it did not last. Perhaps a minute later a sudden, shrill, ear-piercing scream rang out down the hall, one that seemed cut short at its apex. The sounds of slight skirmish ensued with crashing and thumping. It was over in just a few seconds, and the uncomfortable silence returned. It went on that way for hours, with me and the other students hiding in the darkness. We heard more screams and other noises at certain points, but whatever was out there never returned to our door. At some point, the darkness outside finally relented, and it seemed as though the sun was beginning to rise. I know that wasn't the case because my wristwatch told me it was just before 5 p.m. Seeming to affirm that discovery was the fact that the sun was still high in the sky and not anywhere near the horizon. A few minutes later, the sounds of police sirens emerged. Dozens of police and even a SWAT team swarmed the building soon after, ushering all of us out from within room by room. The sense of relief was indescribable as they let us out, but not without a modicum of confusion. Several windows and doors were shattered, and parts of the hallways had been damaged as well, with parts of the hall even appearing melted. Some of the lockers were slumped and malformed like an intense heat had been focused on them. I don't know how that would be possible without causing a fire, but that's apparently what had happened. Once I finally stepped outside, I found my parents waiting for me along with my older sister. They hugged me tighter than ever before, as dozens of other families around us did the same. Behind us, I noticed the police sectioning off the school with barriers and tape as though it were an active crime scene. I questioned my parents on what had happened, but they didn't say much. We returned home and allowed the cops to conduct their investigation, and that's when everything got a lot stranger. Later that same day, I started feeling nauseous and proceeded to puke my guts out for the remainder of the evening. The headache I got then was by far the worst I've ever experienced. My parents at first thought it was the aftermath of the trauma until some of the other parents said the same thing happened to their kids. Before I even knew what was happening, a bunch of dudes in biohazard equipment showed up. They run a bunch of tests on me and tell me to remain calm. My parents and sister were separated from me, and I didn't see them for several days afterwards. The obvious concern was that I and the other kids who felt sick had contracted some sort of virus, and with the previous events at the school, people were worried it was some sort of bioweapon terrorist attack. Thankfully, I woke up the following day feeling loads better. The medical personnel continued running tests, but everything looked relatively normal. Eventually, they discovered that our sickness was not due to a viral agent, bacteria, or mold, but instead due to radiation exposure. Thankfully, it wasn't enough to do serious, long-term damage, but explaining it was another matter entirely, one which we have yet to resolve. Our school was closed for almost a month after this event, which at the time was fantastic news for me. Once we were finally allowed to return to school, we were given zero explanation and expected to forget anything that ever happened. There were never any news reports, interviews, or articles of any kind. It's like the whole thing never happened, and were it not for the memories of those who lived through it, there would not be any record at all. Kyle, the same kid from earlier, ended up not showing up for his English class directly following lunch period. For a while people thought he had something to do with the lockdown, and hell, maybe he did, but I doubt we'll ever know now. He hasn't been seen since that day almost 15 years ago now, and he's not the only one. Our school's principal, the same guy I'd seen in the hall, along with one of the school's janitors, also vanished, never to be seen again. Police found no bodies, nor evidence of abduction or physical conflict, at least not that they're willing to admit publicly. There are no death certificates for any of them, and all three are simply listed as missing, and I doubt that's going to change anytime soon. I've questioned my parents about this, and they claim all the police told them was that a dangerous fugitive had broken into the school that day. A dangerous fugitive who was capable of summoning eclipses, melting lockers, and tearing metal doors from their hinges. Not to mention the whole radiation thing as well. That's another thing too. There is no record of a solar eclipse on that day, and I've looked everywhere I can think to. We weren't allowed anywhere near the school for weeks afterward. Cops sectioned off the streets that led to it, while others patrolled the surrounding woods. On several occasions, we saw guys in blacked-out Suburbans and cargo vans driving down there, but they never formally identified themselves. I overheard my parents talking back then once, and I remember my dad telling my mom that he didn't think the school would ever reopen. He said it didn't feel like the police were conducting a routine investigation, and told her the entire thing seemed more like a cover-up than a crime scene. I've asked them more recently as well, but they seem to have learned very little. I've shared this experience with them too, and although they agree it was weird and disturbing, they don't seem to have any further theories. I've spoken to others who were there that day too, and gotten all manner of mixed responses. Lamar seems to think we were attacked by aliens, while Scotty seems to think our entire school fell into a separate dimension for some time. Maybe there is a logical and boring explanation for all of this, but I have yet to find it. Considering the secrecy, the lack of coverage, and the way the authorities behaved, I'd say it's safe to conclude that something out of the ordinary happened that day, but we may never know what. Whatever it was, I think Kyle saw it, and I think that's why he's gone. When the school finally reopened, it never quite felt the same. We ended up finishing out that year, but it wasn't without incident. Multiple students I know claim to have seen things they couldn't explain in that building, everything from ghosts and demons to wild animals. A few students even suffered full-on mental breakdowns and panic attacks while in the old school. I even know of at least one girl who spent some time in a psych ward afterward. Perhaps most of it could be attributed to PTSD related to the lockdown, or maybe there was something far more sinister at play. Nightmares and bouts of sleep paralysis followed me for years after this event, and I still get them every once in a while, even now. I never know how to describe them, but I wouldn't wish them on anyone. I've always hoped that one day I'd be able to look back on this event with hindsight and understand that it was only scary because I was a kid, like I imagined it wrong or didn't understand. I still can't say I understand what happened, but I can't help but feel more worried now than I was then. As a kid, life goes on and you forget, but as an adult you end up just ruminating on it over and over until you come to a worrying realization. We as humans set up these systems, ways of life, and comfort zones, but there are things out there that can and sometimes will bypass all of them. Things that are far beyond our understanding that we have little power against, and sometimes we are shown firsthand what those things are truly capable of. We've been locked in our classroom for days, and our teacher is starting to act very strangely. Day 1. We had just opened our textbooks to Chapter 8 when the alarms blared overhead. A red strobing light spun by the door as metal slats slid down the wall to seal us in. The others started to stir and panic at their desks. Now. Class, I'm sure everything is fine. Probably just a drill. Mr. Jonas held up his hands in an attempt to soothe the crowd. Just as he was about to open his mouth, Evie came over the intercom. Level 3 contagion is located in the south quadrant of campus. The lockdown protocol is now in effect. Isolation protocol is now in effect. Oh no, the teacher suddenly looked pale and a little panicked. Day 3. I slid my rook across the tile chessboard to overtake Patricia's bishop. She stuck out her tongue in defiance as I removed it from the board. I smirked and then shoved another saltine cracker in my mouth. Mr. Jonas said we shouldn't be in here much longer. It was probably just taking the CDC a while to quarantine and eradicate the contagion. He said it must be a pretty nasty virus if they are keeping us locked in our classrooms. We have enough snacks for another day or so. It's been difficult to ration properly when all you have are crackers, candy, and canned spray cheese. Overall, though, we were keeping our hopes up, which was all we could do. Staying positive for now. Day 5. The room was starting to smell foul. We designated some buckets in the corner as the bathrooms, and they were about half full and beyond putrid. We ran out of food last night. My stomach rumbled with hunger, but I did my best to ignore it. I didn't feel like playing chess or reading anymore. Instead, I just napped at my desk as much as possible to pass the time. I was hoping at any moment I'd be awoken by the doors opening so that I could go home. I missed my parents. Mr. Jonas was losing his composure too. He'd been pretty put together up to this point and ensuring we were all calm. But his eyes looked a little wild now, and he kept pacing the room talking to himself. A few times I heard him cursing under his breath and then reciting prayers. I hope we get out of here soon. Day 8. Bang, bang, bang. A pounding sound coming from the other side of the classroom pulled me from my dreams. Bang, bang, bang. I stayed still to appear asleep, but cracked my eyes just enough to watch as the biology teacher smashed a chair against the steel door over and over again. Bang, bang, bang. He was losing it. Let us out of here. Mr. Jonas screamed as he tossed the chair to the side. I cannot do that, sir. A level 3 contagion has been detected. I have sealed off the affected area, but you must stay isolated for your safety. The robotic voice hummed over the speakers. He screeched profanities at the camera in the corner of the ceiling. Some of the other boys were becoming aggressive as well. There had been some fights the last couple of mornings. Also, some hands going where they shouldn't be going, back behind the fake plants and lab equipment. It seemed as if we were slowly devolving, becoming an enclosure of chimpanzees, like one you'd see at the zoo, but only hungrier. We needed out, or something terrible was going to happen. Day 10. We'd been on a diet of tap water for the past 5 days. I felt dizzy every time I stood at my desk. The room would spin and I'd almost black out. I kept my footing by sheer force of willpower. I had this irrational fear that if I passed out, I'd be eaten by my classmates, like a pack of hyenas on a gazelle. I feasted on my intestines as they spilled across the tiled floor. It sounded crazy if I said it out loud, but when I looked around the room and saw all the hungry faces, I didn't think the idea was too far-fetched after all. Mr. Jonas hasn't said a word in over 12 hours. He's just been sitting at his desk, carving something into the surface of it with an X-Acto knife. For the first time today, I had the thought that maybe we weren't going to make it out of this. Maybe we were all going to die in this classroom. I hung my head and cried. Day 13. Mr. Jonas. Mr. Jonas, stop. Micah cried. Don't you see? We have to do this. We need food. It's survival 101. When the pack is suffering and food is scarce, they turn on their weakest member. It's simple biology. Survival of the fittest. Mr. Jonas had his hands around Trevor's neck, squeezing so hard that the boy's eyes were about to pop from his skull. Trevor struggled beneath him, but he was frail and small for his age. Micah grabbed a large beaker from the table and lifted it high over his head. Mr. Jonas, stop now. Don't make me do this. But the teacher was long gone. His eyes gleamed with delight as drool dripped down his chin from salivating at the thought of a meal. I jumped to my feet as Micah brought the beaker down as hard as he could onto Mr. Jonas' head. It shattered to pieces on impact, knocking the teacher out cold. I helped Micah push him off Trevor. The poor kid was wheezing and gasping for air as tears streamed down his face. You're all right. It's okay. You're all right. Micah patted the kid on the back, trying to calm him as he wailed. Suddenly there was a scream like a war cry and Mr. Jonas was airborne. He leaped across a desk and plowed into Micah. They both went sprawling across the tile. Micah resisted him, but Mr. Jonas ended up on top and began dropping his elbows viciously on Micah's face, causing blood to spew from his nose and mouth. Static filled my mind. I didn't think, I only reacted. I reached down and picked up a hunk of glass from the broken beaker, grabbed Mr. Jonas's shaggy hair, and pulled it back to extend his neck. I pulled the glass through the meat of his throat as hard as I could. I'd never seen so much blood before. It poured in a waterfall across Micah's chest. Mr. Jonas fell to the side once more, this time never to get up again. I stared at my blood-soaked hands. I felt nothing. No remorse, no fear. Only static. Suddenly the metal slats retracted into the ceiling and the door swung open. Lockdown protocol has been lifted. Please continue with your regular schedules. Lockdown protocol has been lifted. Her cheery robotic voice seemed so distant and out of place now. The other students gathered around me, just staring at the pool of blood. I think it was the hunger talking, but a part of me wanted to know what it tasted like. I think the others did too. Thankfully, before that could happen, a man in a suit strolled into the classroom. Hello, class. His perfect teeth gleamed under the LEDs. Before we could say anything, a team of adults in overalls poured into the room. Some began taking pictures of everything. Others started cleaning up Mr. Jonas. One man with gray hair dropped a large box on the teacher's desk and opened it. He then started throwing fresh fruit and granola bars to each of the students. We devoured everything he gave us. I started to feel more like myself after 2 bananas and 4 granola bars. They tasted like heaven, a sweet salvation. The first man with the nice teeth in the expensive suit waited until we were all done before he addressed us again. I know it's been a long 13 days, guys. I appreciate you all hanging in there. I've alerted each of your parents that you've been cleared to go home. The classroom erupted in cheers as we all hugged each other. Even Micah, covered in gore, danced around excitedly. You'll all be able to go home soon, but first I just need to do a little debrief with each of you before you go. I'm going to set up in the counselor's office, and Mr. Moses here is going to bring you down one by one to give your account of what happened here during isolation. We all nodded our heads in agreement, anything to get out of here. Mr. Moses, the man with the gray hair and the snacks, took us down one by one, and we spilled our guts to the man with the nice teeth. When I gave my story on what it was like, I still felt numb. Even when describing how I killed Mr. Jonas, I just felt nothing. It wasn't until I'd gotten home that evening that I broke down and wept. Once I was in my mother's arms, I cried and cried until I couldn't anymore. Then I ate more food than I ever had. I shoveled pasta down my throat until I thought my stomach would burst. It was a good feeling. To be full. To be human again. Years later, while I was at university, a whistleblower leaked that what we'd endured at the school was a government cover-up for a top-secret experiment. There had been no virus, no contagion. It began as an experiment to test the artificial intelligence system they had at the school. But then it morphed into a social experiment to see how long we would last before someone was murdered or severely harmed. To test the boundaries of civility and moral character under immense pressure. Just in case there was a real issue with the code and the AI and this scenario became a reality elsewhere. When I'd killed Mr. Jonas, it had ended the experiment. The news had made me sick to my stomach. I was angry and disgusted for weeks. I was okay with it now, though. You see, Trevor may have been small, the weakest member of the Pride perhaps, but he was also a genius. With his hacking expertise, we were able to locate Mr. Nice Teeth and Mr. Moses. It's been 6 days so far, and every time they scream and hit the door with a chair, I just can't help but smile. It's a little experiment a few of us are conducting. It'll end when someone is murdered or severely injured. Maybe. I hid in a closet during a school lockdown and heard what happened. The truth is much worse than what they told us. I'm very happy I'm not in school anymore. I graduated a few years ago, but more and more every day I hear about incidents at school. On the news, on the internet, and texts, my friends send me all sorts of horror stories. But the stories online are the ones I'm always finding myself glancing through. I've seen stories online of people relating how their school went into lockdown, and the story ends up being about some hobo who had been living under the school, or some crazy person from down the street who finally snapped one day. I don't know if they're true, but all I know is our school went into lockdown once. And I don't know if even the people at my school know the whole story as to what happened. I don't even know if I understand it myself. It still seems like a sort of fever dream, something that didn't happen, couldn't happen. It was the middle of the third period, math. I had just finished a big test. I found out later I had made a bunch of mistakes and ended up getting a D, but that's not important to the story. I used the hall pass to go use the bathroom. Unfortunately, the school bathrooms were all located at the stairwells, and of course, the bathrooms on the first floor, where I was, were closed for repairs. I had to go up to the second floor, but before I got there, the bell rang. The bell never rang during class before, but as it did, an announcement came over the PA. Students and faculty, we are entering lockdown. This is not a drill. Please, all students and faculty follow all school procedures. I froze. I could hear sirens approaching. I came out of the stairwell, but already the doors in the hallway were closing, and I could hear them locking. I was alone and out in the open. I could go into the bathroom now, but the doors had no locks on them since my freshman year, after some juniors trapped a freshman in the bathroom and duct taped him inside a stall. They removed the ability to lock them at all. If somebody was wandering the school, I'd have no chance if I went into there. I ran down the hall. I could see classrooms turning out their lights and covering the windows. I couldn't turn to them for help. All the instructions said to not answer the door. I had to find someplace safe nearby before something happened. I turned a corner and I saw my chance. The janitor's closet was open. Lunch was up next period, so he was probably out setting up tables when the announcement was made. He wasn't in there, and it could easily be locked from the inside, so I jumped in and shut off the light. The only light I saw was from the bottom of the door. I waited, and the sirens grew closer and eventually stopped. Time passed, and I wasn't sure if I was happy that I couldn't hear anything going on or tense because I had no idea what was happening. Then I heard footsteps. Lots of them. They stopped in the hallway. It must have been the police. I could hear radios and other assorted noises. I didn't think it could be some sort of lone gunman or nutcase, so I listened. One guy in particular sounded like the one in charge. "Okay, are we in position?" Another guy answered. I didn't know what his rank was, but clearly he was not in charge of the first guy. "Yes, sir. We know the suspect is here in the building. The C team is across the campus, as ordered, and the B team is covering the back entrances. He will not exit the building on our watch." The chief responded. "Good. Remember, he could look like anyone. But he must not escape. It's my fault he's here, and I must deal with him." I couldn't hear much for a while. There was too much movement, too many people all talking to each other to make out anybody from where I sat. I just waited for a little while. Maybe it would all just be over soon, and I could leave the closet and go back to class. Then, that's when it all happened. The chief yelled out, "Hold it! Put your hands in the air!" The commotion outside stopped abruptly. A moment later, clothes rustled loudly as what sounded like a large number of guns were drawn. "Lay down on the ground. Leave your hands where we can see them." It stayed quiet, except for a few of the guns cocking. I said down the ground, "Don't you dare try what I think you're going to do. You're not at the institute anymore." I thought I would hear shots go off, back and forth, and eventually somebody saying "suspect down." What I didn't expect was the scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't somebody crying out in terror. It was like a wounded animal, mixed with the sound of a bandsaw hitting concrete. I've never heard anything like it before, and I hope I never hear it again. Then the guns began to fire. The horrible scream happened again, and then other screams, and then the sounds of tearing. I saw the shadows under the door as people moved and fell over, and heard the telltale splatter of gore as it soaked the floor. There was another gunshot, and I nearly yelled out myself when a bullet punched through part of the doorway. It wasn't very big, but I put my eye up against it, and I could see a group of people being attacked by somebody. But something wasn't right about him. He looked too long in places like he'd been stretched in a taffy machine. He was moving so fast, though, that I couldn't make anything out, except for him grabbing people and throwing them around like they were nothing. There was blood everywhere. More gunshots. The scream happened again. And again. I pulled away from the bullet hole and sat back in the closet. Then the scream began to fade. I heard a thud, and then more footsteps. The chief spoke again, but he was breathing heavily like he had been badly wounded. "Team A. He's down. I repeat, he's down. We need a cleanup immediately." I didn't move. I wanted to look again, but as curious as I was, I didn't want to see. I heard a lot of commotion for a long time, and then nothing. I don't know how long it was after that, but then the PA announced the lockdown had ended. I came out of the closet. I tried not to look, but for all the sounds I had heard, there was not as much sign of a fight as I thought there would be. Even the blood I had seen in that brief time through the bullet hole had all been removed. I went back to my class and just told everyone I had hidden in a stall in the bathroom. People were impressed with my guts for doing it, but if nobody else had heard that scream, I certainly didn't want to bring it up. As you might expect, we all went home early that day. Police and EMTs were everywhere, but as far as I could see, nobody was being taken away by either. My parents came and were so happy that I was all right. They had been following everything on the news and came as soon as they could. At home that night, I ate dinner and waited to see what happened on the news. The live coverage had ended a long time ago, but when the news came back on at 10 o'clock, I wanted to see everything. As it started, I saw classes had been canceled for the rest of the week, but then things started to get weird. The news talked about a student who they refused to name, how he had come to school armed but had been taken into custody after a short firefight. Stranger still, in the footage of the hallway where the scuffle had taken place, the door of the closest which had been my refuge was unscathed. Not so much as a scratch on it, let alone bullet holes. It appeared to have been replaced outright, well before any investigation could have been completed. I saw pictures of the student being led away in cuffs. He didn't have a mark on him. He wasn't even wounded as he was pushed into a police car and driven away. All I saw was him fighting and yelling. Even in my glimpses through that bullet hole, I knew that wasn't the same one I saw. The clothes were completely different. The one I had seen had been wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. The one getting into the police car was wearing a white shirt and shorts. The news said no one had been hurt despite the gunfire. But I knew people had been wounded, even killed. I'd heard them screaming in agony as something vicious had attacked them. And then there was what that chief guy had said. Talking about something being his fault. The institution. That he could look like anyone. I don't know what happened that day for certain. I didn't see enough, I didn't hear enough to get the full story. But this is what I can tell you. I know there was no shooter at our school. I know that someone was arrested that day. Someone who I didn't know, who I never heard about ever again. That's right, a shooter who never made another day's worth of news. Just disappeared. When was the last time that ever happened? I know that Chief Guy and his squads were not cops. I don't know who they were, but I know cops don't clean up a crime scene like that. And no human being has ever screamed like that. Ever. But whatever it was that I heard attacking those people, all I know is that it came into that hallway where I was. I was alone, and if it hadn't been for that janitor's closet, I wouldn't have been safe. It could have looked like anyone. Something tells me that the squad wouldn't have helped me either. It could have looked like anyone. What was it? How long had it been in our school? Had I ever been alone with it and never knew what it was? Who were those people who had come for it? Where had it come from? And, good God, is it dead? Lockdown at my elementary school. School lockdown drills are now as common as fire drills. I'm sure every school or county has its own style or individual protocol, but essentially, it's the same across the board, everyone is to get into a classroom, lock the door, turn off the lights, group into a part of the room out of view from the windows and doors, and stay completely silent. The goal is to disappear from whatever hypothetical active shooter is roaming the hallways. Without these drills, well, the same thing would happen as when school shooters first started popping up. Chaos, people fleeing in all directions, creating a frenzy of targets to choose from. And more people would die. More children would die. I was a counselor for an elementary school. My last position was my second, the first being in a hellhole for 2 years. That first elementary school was a mess, mostly because of the principal. He was old and tired, walking the halls with frazzled white hair and wrinkled button-up shirts with no tie. It seemed he was over it all, counting down the days until his retirement. He showed little interest in my role, practically rolling his eyes at whatever issue brought a child to my door. He had the whole "this generation is soft" mentality. Kids aren't depressed or anxious, they're just whining. He handed out reprimands and punishments without any real investigations and treated the staff poorly. And he slacked on drills. I remember being horrified on my first fire drill there, standing out in the playground in the near-freezing autumn breeze, surrounded by cold and confused students as scattered and disorganized as staff tried to somehow get accountability. The staff and I tried to schedule more drills and tried to get him in on planning, but he couldn't care less. Eventually, he was relieved when teachers had enough and went to the board, but by then I lost motivation and needed a change. Where I ended up next was refreshing. The principal, a tall and slim middle-aged man with a square jaw and kind eyes, always wearing some version of a cartoon-themed tie, and the staff here take their jobs rather seriously, almost to the point of me feeling too intimidated to share ideas during meetings when I first arrived. Fortunately, I loosened up over time, and when everyone saw how much I cared for the children, I was accepted. I loved it there. I quit 2 months later. The reason I quit is something I haven't quite gotten over. I still dream about it. I still hear the sounds. The sounds didn't make sense as they were happening, but came together afterward into a horrific realization. ******, I had been making my rounds that day, checking on my more needy students during their classes, making sure no one was on the verge of a meltdown or anything. I remember feeling relieved to be walking around because I had been sitting in the nurse's office with a first grader who ran and slipped on the slick floor the custodian was in the middle of mopping. Luckily, there was nothing wrong with the child, but I advised the custodian to put up a "Caution Wet Floor" sign before we had a lawsuit on our hands. I was feeling good until lockdown. Lockdown, lockdown. It was one of the office administrators over the loudspeaker. At first, I was just surprised. Then I felt my heart jump and my fingertips turn icy as I realized the reason I was surprised. There was no drill scheduled that day, which meant this was not a drill. When the announcement blared, I had just opened the door to peek into a kindergarten classroom. When the overhead speaker clicked, indicating the end of the announcement, my eyes met with the teacher, Mrs. Jameson. We froze, staring at one another for a good 3 seconds, her standing with a pointer in one hand with her class all neatly seated on the carpet area. The students were silent, some looking at her and some at me. Then she and I came to some kind of unspoken agreement. Training kicked in. We both sighed casually and smiled down at the kids. Mrs. Jameson said, "Well, kids, looks like we got a lockdown drill. Let's show Ms. Vasquez how well we can do." "Sounds good to me," I said as I closed the door and pulled down the curtain to the door's tiny window. "I'd love to see how this class does during a lockdown drill. I might have some rewards if you do well." Then I remembered something. I said to the teacher's Janet, "I'll be right back," before running out of the room. I remembered the fourth graders were around the corner from where I was, outside their classrooms, and scattered all around the hallway, putting up holiday decorations. I was afraid of the chaos that might ensue, kids pushing and shoving to get back to their classrooms instead of just ducking into the nearest one, as was protocol. Luckily, it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. Everyone was calm and well-versed on what to do. I herded some lingering and confused kids into rooms and was about to run back to the kindergarten room when I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. When I turned around, I couldn't help but mutter, "Seriously?" At the end of the hallway, sitting just outside the edge of sunlight that cast through the windows of the double-door exit nearby, was a third grader. He was curled up, knees to chest, hood pulled over, but I knew who it was. Charlie. Probably doodling in his damn sketchbook, listening to music even though electronic devices were banned. The school had warned him dozens of times, but he always managed to sneak his phone in. Honestly, I've spotted him a few times with the buds in his ears, but let it go. Music and drawing were his thing, and he had it rough at home. I ran over, pulled his hood back, and yanked the earbuds out of his ears. "Lockdown, sweetie. Come on." I was tempted to sound more urgent, but I wanted to remain casual and not alarm him. Charlie, like all students in that school, took lockdown drills seriously. His eyes widened and he jumped up. We ran over to the nearest room, the computer lab, and I used my key to let him in. Then I hesitated. The right thing to do would be to go in with him. But I thought about Mrs. Janet Jameson. She was young, in her second year teaching, and her IA was out sick. I felt I had to help her manage those kids. There was no telling how long this lockdown would last, and she needed the help. I closed the door and turned. I realized I was probably the last one still in the hallway. It was eerie, not having another soul in the hallway. It felt abandoned. No, hollow was the right word. It felt like a hollow, like a cave. I heard footsteps. Rhythmic thuds on the linoleum floor. Boots? No, they were softer than that, although too heavy to be sneakers. Or maybe the person making them was big. It was not too far off. I guess I should explain the layout. The school is only one story. From a bird's eye view, the hallways carve out what looks like two cubes close stacked on top of each other, the top being where the entrance was. The same middle hallway fused those two cubes. I was at the far bottom of the bottom cube, close to the left corner. The footsteps sounded as if coming down the left side of the top cube, so that if I were to turn down that left corner, I'd end up far away yet face to face with whoever was there. The main problem was that Janet Jameson's room was down that left side hallway. I took off my flats and tiptoed to the left corner. I was tempted to look, to just peek, but at the same time, was too scared the person would see me. The steps stopped, and I heard a hard rattling. He was trying a door. When it didn't open, I heard him whisper something, probably cursing to himself, before continuing to walk. And it was him, judging from that whisper. The voice was too deep to be a woman. I don't know why I waited there, listening to the footsteps coming my way. I suppose I wasn't thinking clearly because I could have just gone into the nearest room. Yet I had an anxious one-track mind of getting to Mrs. Jameson's room. The man tried another locked door. Another hoarse whisper. I thought I could just sprint to the room, unlock the door, and rush in. No, he'd see me, and that would only draw attention to Mrs. Jameson's room, thus endangering the children. Plus, what if I couldn't get the key in and unlock the door in time before he ran up to me? I took a backward step, preparing to turn and sprint to the right corner if he got too close, when I heard S shift in the echoing steps. I listened and realized he turned down the middle hallway. I drew in a deep breath and exhaled shakily as I braved to peek around the corner. I was right. I saw no one and yet heard another door being tried, so he had to be down that middle hallway. Then, to my surprise, Mrs. Jameson's door opened without a sound. I saw her face appear in the darkness of the room. Our eyes met, and she beckoned me. I didn't hesitate. I didn't want to wait any longer and risk freezing up. I ran and made it in. As soon as I did, Janet carefully closed the door. I saw all the kids clustered in the darkest corner of the room, sitting and staring expectantly at me. "What are you doing?" I whispered harshly to the kindergarten teacher. "You are not supposed to open the door during a lockdown." "Well, you're welcome." She sighed. "I just had a bad feeling because you said you'd be back. Plus, after I heard the last door closed, I heard a couple of your steps. I assumed they were yours because they clicked like shoes, and just knew you were still out there." My shoulders slumped. I could no longer hide my relief. Or gratefulness. "Thank you, Janet." I saw her teeth show in the dark as she smiled. "No problem. Just help me keep the kids calm and dash." We heard a noise outside. It wasn't close, but it was strange, like a heavy thud. "What's that?" asked one of the kids. We shushed him and listened. Silence. Nothing happened for the next 20 or so minutes. Janet and I handed out coloring books and crayons for the kids to color. We made sure everyone was for every color. It sounds petty, but the last thing we needed was kids asking to borrow colors and start bickering over it. One of the little girls didn't color. She just stared at us with worrying and waiting eyes. She knew this wasn't a drill. I sat down in one of the small chairs and I signaled her to come to me. She immediately ran over, sat in my lap, and buried her head into my shoulder. I put my arms around her and whispered reassuring words. The rest of the class noticed this, and unfortunately, it seemed to make them anxious. Just then we heard footsteps. We all stiffened. The steps were coming our way. Janet and I met eyes. She was completely pale. The footsteps seemed heavier and less rhythmic. At one point there was some shuffling and some rubbing or dragging of clothes. The man must have stumbled and slid against the wall. Was he hurt? Then the steps resumed, getting closer still. My eyes shot toward the door. The girl and I gripped each other hard with rigid bodies. We felt almost fused as one statue. There was ringing in my ears, and my eyes burned as I stared unblinkingly at the doorknob. Then bang. It was as if someone threw their weight into the door. The kid screamed. Janet screamed. I almost did, but instead put the girl down and ran over to Janet and shook her by the shoulders. She stopped screaming and I pointed to the horrified children. At that moment, intense weight seemed to come upon us. I felt everything fade away for a moment, the screaming, the darkness of the room, the single heavy knock against the door that followed after the bang, and within our gaze we came to a mutual declaration. The kids. We both thought it. We had to keep them safe. That was all that mattered. "The bookshelf," she exclaimed. I understood and nodded. In response, I said, "Use the blanket, okay?" She nodded, also understanding. Then we separated. I ran to the bookshelf and began pushing. It was used to hold other supplies like containers of extra glue sticks and yarn, not books, so it was not as heavy as it could have been. But it was heavy. Shannon. I got it. I got it. The shelf slid across the room, getting easier as I built momentum. The kids were still screaming, but it started to quiet down. I glanced over and saw Janet had already draped the ends of a large green blanket over the coat cubby and another bookshelf so it hung over everyone like a makeshift tent. Good. It would give the kids the sense of feeling hidden. She heard Janet trying to talk them down. By now the man was trying the doorknob and I heard a low grunt. I kept pushing and finally, with gritted teeth and every muscle in my body hard as a rock, I made it. I turned the shelf the long way and rested it against the door. I turned my back to the shelf and leaned against it. "Where's Ms. Vasquez?" a child cried out. Then the other kids followed and began anxiously calling out to me. "I'm here, guys." I tried to sound casual, but my voice was shaking. "You guys are the fort and I'm the lookout." Janet said, "Yes, she's on the lookout. She'll tell us if we are clear or in danger." "Ms. Vasquez, are we clear?" "Oh yes, the danger was here, but it passed. We're all clear, kids." As I said this, I prayed there wasn't another thrash against the door. There wasn't. It all stopped. The doorknob stopped jiggling. Silence. After a few minutes, I slid down to sit on the floor, still leaning against the bookshelf. As the silence settled in, and I called out 5 all clears to the kids to offer consistent reassurance, my body began to slowly settle. The moment that crashes against the door happened, I felt amped up, light on my feet. Strong. I remember when one of these bookshelves was being moved from one classroom to another. It took 2 custodians, grown men, to slide it along with a struggle. I had managed it alone. It was all adrenaline, and now with the kids calm enough to be singing softly along with Janet under the blanket, I was crashing. To top off my sense of ease, I saw flashing red and blue lights coming in through the window. It was over, and I felt sick. I even smelled copper in the air. I rubbed my nose to check for a nosebleed, but strangely saw nothing. I looked at lights dancing across the ceiling. "Yay, guys," I called in the fakest peppy voice. "The policemen are here." They had seen the lights and were already cheering. I tried to say something else. I can't remember what, but it was probably to remind them they still had to remain quiet. Rather than words, I let out a gut-tightening heave. Not much came out, just enough for me to spit. I felt something. Since I was no longer sweating and my skin felt cold and clammy, I became aware of some warmth beneath me, like I was sitting in a puddle. I frowned. I soiled myself, I thought. Great. I shifted to examine my jeans to see if it was urine or feces. I saw darkness on the beige tile. I hesitantly touched it. It was too thick to be urine. And I didn't smell anything. Or rather, I didn't smell any bodily waste. That coppery scent from earlier was stronger now. As I leaned away from the bookshelf, I saw the liquid hadn't come from me, but from beneath the bookshelf. No, not the bookshelf. It came from under the door. A stone dropped in my chest as I realized what the liquid was. It was blood. Blood had been oozing into the room. What the hell? The noise came from the hallway. The calm rumble of footsteps, deep voices in casual conversation, and chaotic static from walkie-talkies, the police, and it didn't sound like they were in a rush. We all heard them coming closer. Then they stopped walking. They stopped talking. We could only hear the only thing heard were the walkies. Why were they just standing there? Then someone among them broke the silence with a holy shit before a storm of urgent footsteps came and stopped right outside Janet Jameson's door. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Eventually, the all clear was given to every class except ours. Janet and I didn't protest or ask any questions. We were too confused, too overwhelmed and worn out. We were at a point of absolute submission because we thought obedience would make things go faster and we could just all go home. I asked Janet for the blanket to cover myself and the pool under me before she turned the lights on and allowed the kids to stretch out. I whispered to her about the blood, and she only threw her head back and closed her eyes as if to say what else. After an hour, the window gates were unlocked. Janet, the kids, and I exited the class through the windows so we didn't have to open the door and see whatever was happening. I looked stupidly at one of the officers after climbing out the window and said, "I have blood on me." "It's not mine." I just said it. I felt I had to before they noticed it themselves. The officer just nodded grimly, with no sign of surprise. Then he escorted Janet and I to sit at the open end of an ambulance to be examined. When the medics gave the thumbs up, 2 officers came over. At first, they just stood there, heads up but eyes staring at the ground. Then they removed their hats and told us there was a dead body in front of Janet Jameson's classroom door. What do you say to something like that? They paused as if giving us room to react or respond. Janet and I just looked at one another. They looked at us. What did they want us to say? As it turns out, they weren't waiting for a reaction. They were giving moment to let that news sink in before they hit us with another. This time, we reacted. This time we jumped up, asking what they meant. Asking why and how. We freaked. We acted like they told us the sky just fell. The dead body was the principal. The officers tried to calm us. When we were finally able to sit and listen, one of them offered to explain everything. Then they looked at one another, agreeing on something, before looking directly at me. "We could show you what happened." I tensed up. The other officer quickly added, "From the cameras, he means. You don't have to see him. Watch the recordings." It seemed the invitation was exclusively for me, and Janet didn't say anything. At the time, I didn't understand, but looking back, I think everyone felt I had a right to see. I think they felt I deserved a clear story because I'm the one with someone else's blood all over my pants. I was taken inside the building into the main office. A man with a polo and jeans was seated at one of the administrator's desks, computer ready, waiting for me. With a nod from the officers that escorted me in, the man in the polo hit play. 9 camera shots were playing at once on the screen, 3 in each row, all black and white. They all played pretty much the same thing at that moment, the beginning of the lockdown. Just kids through the halls, into classrooms. Each camera just showed incoherent blurs and shifting shades of gray. In less than a minute, the blurs disappeared and the hallway was bare. My attention was then drawn to 2 screens. One showed me taking my shoes off and tiptoeing. The other showed the principal walking down the left side hallway. The principal stopped at a door and grabbed the door handle. The officer next to me said, "The school was transitioning into having new doors, correct? New locks?" We were. Our doors were old and were being upgraded, which meant new locks, which meant new keys. At that point, less than half the rooms in the building had new doors, and not everyone had a key. He was checking the doors, making sure someone didn't end up in a room they didn't have a key to. Of course, I hadn't known that. With a stiff body and wide eyes, I watched my past self on the screen, cowering, truly believing I was in danger. The principal made the turn, and a moment later I was dashing to Janet's room. I was gone. Now there was only the principal. After checking a door, he seemed satisfied, like he all was finished. He leaned into the door and seemed to speak before stepping back. The hoarse whispering. It wasn't cursing, it was him telling the people inside it was only him, and not to be afraid. I saw the caution wet floors sign was 3 feet away. I noticed it because something in my gut knew what was going to happen next. The principal slipped. He did a brief little shuffle, almost comedically, before his legs came out from under him. His head bounced off the floor. There was no audio, but I could hear the hollow thump. I could hear it then in my head because I had heard it in real time. That heavy thud. The one from when we shushed the boy from asking what that noise was. Jesus, that was his head, I said aloud. No one answered. The principal slowly stood, leaving a dark splatter behind on the floor. His legs were shaky. He looked left and right, seemingly confused. He held one hand to his head and began to walk back the way he came. He stumbled. His knees shook. By now darkness was dripping on the floor. Then he slowly sank to the ground, as if he was suddenly sleepy and needed a nap. Then he just lay there. The man in the polo moved the computer mouse to slide the time bar to 22 minutes later. As if fast-forwarded, a dark mass appeared and grew into a perfect circle around the principal's head. The video resumed with the principal stirring. He stood and stepped back, seemingly horrified by the pool of darkness. He stepped around the puddle and walked. I squinted and saw he had dropped something. He rounded the corner, making his way to the closest room for help. Janet's room. He wavered on rubbery legs. At one point, he leaned against the wall as he walked a few steps, sliding along with his shoulder, before pushing off and trying to balance again. He finally made it to Janet's door and fell against it. We had screamed. He raised a fist and gave one strong pound before trying the knob. He patted his pockets, looked around, slumped his head, and tried the knob again. The thing he had dropped. His keys. I felt hot tears run down my cheeks as I watched him sink to sit with his back against the door. His head drooped. And that was it. The man in the polo stopped the video but kept looking at the screen. I shook my head, feeling confused even though there was nothing to be confused about. I thought about where I had been at that point in the video. I had been sitting with my back against the bookcase. This means he and I had been sitting back to back, just feet apart, while he slowly bled out and died. And I had sat his blood, the blood that dripped from his cracked head. The children sang softly as the darkness pooled and soaked into my pants. And it was me. I had kept him out. No, I didn't know. I felt cold and afraid. I stepped back away from the officers. I didn't mean to kill him. The officer's face dropped. Wah, no. Ma'am, no, we aren't blaming you. We just felt you should know. Because I did it, right? I was losing my sense of reality. I couldn't feel my legs and felt like I was somehow floating and sinking at the same time. I'm going to jail. I should. Because I fucking kept him out. Ma'am. I shoved a goddamn bookcase against the door. The officer was shaking his head, reaching out to me. I passed out. Asterisk, 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 I quit being a counselor. I just stopped showing up. It was Janet who was kind enough to speak to the school county administration. She managed to turn my unannounced permanent absence into an official resignation. No one argued. No one asked me to sign or do anything. No one bothered me because they all knew. They all knew I let him die. Janet said they all feel sorry for us, her and I. They all sympathized with our situation. But I know that's bullshit. I ripped up every get well card and popped every we miss you balloon that got delivered. They're all pretending. Acting as if I hadn't let Daniel Seymour Hutchins, a married man with 2 children at home and 253 others at work, slip away in an empty hallway, alone. I don't call him by name. I prefer to remember him as the principal. It creates some distance, like we were only co-workers. Strictly professional. Not at all like he was the shoulder I cried on when I broke up with my boyfriend, or the man who went over the spending limit for me when we did the blind gift exchange for Christmas. To top it off, we were never really in any danger. The lockdown was initiated because the police were called by a witness who claimed to see a man with a gun wandering the streets just a few blocks away, drunkenly harassing people. When the police arrived, the man was very drunk and did not have a gun. A brief standoff between him and the police went on for half an hour before the drunk gave up. And guess what? When the police examined the weapon, it turned out to be fake. It turned out to be a fucking paintball pistol. But that doesn't upset nearly as much as the thought that still haunts me: I could have just fucking looked. That's all I can think of. There were 2 instances where I could have just looked and saved everything. The first time, I could have just poked my head around that corner and saw the principal walking my way. Then I would have put my shoes back on, stepped out, and given him a wave. And he would approach me and pass right by that yellow caution wet floor sign. The other time I could have looked was when I gave the second all clear to Janet and the kids. I can deny it all I want. I can it in retrospect. But I had known. I knew at that moment something wasn't right, because I just then realized we hadn't heard any footsteps walking away from the door. So why the silence? I had thought briefly, if they were still there. At that moment I thought about standing up, reaching across the bookshelf, and pushing the door window's curtain aside to peek out into the hallway. If I had, I would have seen the blood trail leading to the door. Then I would have looked down to see the principal slumped over. I would have shoved the shelf aside, opened the door, and used that stupid green tin blanket to apply pressure and stop the bleeding. I would have done all that, but I didn't. I didn't because protocol said to stay away from the windows and doors. And I was just plain scared. I ignored my gut and hid behind the procedure. I was a coward. When I lay awake at night, I always hear a thump. What follows are the sounds of the principal walking and stumbling through my apartment. I can hear his feet on the linoleum even though I have carpet. I hear his shoulder brushing against the wall. Then I heard a heavy crash and knock on my closed bedroom door. I can almost see the knob jiggling. At that point, I always get up and frantically pull the bedroom door open. I do it every time. And every single night, without fail, I collapse into tears when I see no one is there.